Howdy, and welcome to Pesticides and Pest-Resistant Plants. Pesticides are comprised of both herbicides and insecticides. Herbicides are chemicals used to control weed and plant pests. Insecticides are those chemicals used to control insect pests. Pesticide resistance is said to occur in a plant or insect community when the pesticide is no longer effective in controlling the target pest. Since 1994, there has been a rapidly expanding use of gene-modified plants that exhibit insect-resistant traits. Our focus will be upon managing insect resistance as it relates to chemical pesticide applications and more broadly to gene-modified insect-resistant plants. Insect resistance is the adaptation of an insect species to a pesticide or resistant plant species, resulting in a decreased susceptibility to that chemical or resistant species. In other words, pests develop a resistance to chemicals or genetics through the process of selection after long-term exposure. When genetic selection takes place, the pesticide or insect-resistant plant no longer kills or resists the pest as efficiently or as effectively. The most resistant organisms are the ones that survive and pass on their genetic traits to their offspring. When pests become resistant to more than one class of pesticide, they are said to exhibit multiple insect resistance. This may occur if one pesticide is used until a pest displays resistance, and then another pesticide is used until the pest also becomes resistant to that chemical. Cross-resistance may occur when the genetic mutation that made the pest resistant to one pesticide also makes it resistant to other pesticides, especially in pesticides with similar modes of action or in the same class of pesticides. After every new insecticide introduction, cases of resistance have appeared some 2 to 20 years after their introduction in a number of key pest species. This phenomenon has been described as the pesticide treadmill, and the sequence is familiar. As a result of continued applications of pesticides over time, the pest involves resistance to the insecticide, and the resistant strain becomes increasingly difficult to control at a labeled rate and frequency. This in turn has often led to more frequent applications of the insecticide. The intensity of the resistance and the frequency of insecticide-resistant individuals in the population both increase still further, and problems of control continue to worsen as yet more product is applied. Eventually, users switch to another pesticide if one is available. The genetics of the heritable resistant traits and the intensive repeated application of pesticides together are responsible for the rapid buildup of resistance in most insects and mites. The development of resistance management strategies requires a comprehensive knowledge of mechanisms by which the insect evolves insecticide resistance. Signs of insect pests developing resistance to products include failure in control, need for higher rates, need for more complete coverage, and reduced residual effects, all translating to added costs for the grower. Along the way, the grower may also be forced to resort to more expensive but less effective materials. Problems emerge when a product at a certain rate kills all the susceptible insects, but not the resistant ones. When some susceptibles are left to mate with a few resistant types, resistance is avoided or at least diluted. However, when only resistant individuals are left to mate with other resistant survivors in the surrounding fields, the results can be disastrous. For growers, insecticide resistance can be a tremendous financial liability in both increased input costs and yield losses sustained from pest damage. Insecticide resistance occurs when individuals in a population possesses genes that make them less susceptible to a control tactic or pesticide. Resistance is spread in a population through continued pesticide use or continued long-term use of insect-resistant plant varieties that favors the offspring of resistant individuals. Resistance works by whatever mechanism is conveyed through the genes. The first documented case of insecticide resistance was that of citrus scale and cyanide in the early 20th century. 12 cases were documented before the advent of synthetic insecticides. Since the late 1940s, hundreds of species have been confirmed as resistant, and the list continues to grow. It is estimated that over 500 species have developed a resistance to pesticides. Other sources estimate the number to be around 1,000 species since 1945. The presence of pesticide resistance in a pest community challenges pest management strategies, significantly raising the risk of damage by increased pest infestations, results in costly efforts to control the insect population, and results in decreased agricultural productivity. Pesticide resistance also significantly raises concern in urban settings where insect and weed pests may pose public health hazards. Insect selection pressure is expressed in populations of organisms. Once insecticide resistance is documented in a population, it usually increases rapidly. Resistance may also be found to occur against non-pesticide pest control techniques. The failure of a chemical treatment to control a pest is not adequate proof of the existence of resistance. Frequently, a pest becomes resistant to a pesticide because it develops physiological changes that protect it from the chemical. In some cases, a pest may gain an increased number of copies of a gene, allowing it to produce more of a protective enzyme that breaks down the insecticide into less toxic chemicals. The development of insecticide resistance occurs over several generations. While some other members of the population are killed by the insecticide, the one that is resistant to chemical control lives on and carries the genetic trait for insecticide resistance. The continued application of insecticides with the same mode of action and selection for the resistant individuals continues so the proportion of resistant insects in the population increases, while susceptible individuals are eliminated by the insecticide. While several pests may escape the effects of pesticide control for one reason or another, 1 in 10 of the survivors may actually be genetically resistant to the chemical control. The surviving pest that carries the insecticide-resistant gene survives to pass that gene on to future generations. As pesticide pressure continues, the more susceptible members of the insect population are killed, leaving the more resistant members to reproduce. Many of the offspring of these resistant pests are, like their parents, resistant to the effects of the insecticide. The continued use of the insecticide has selectively killed the weaker, more susceptible members of the pest population, while the genetically resistant members have survived. Through the process of natural selection, the continued use of the pesticide over several pest generations has allowed resistant members of the population to grow in number. In this diagram, 85% of the pest population is no longer susceptible to the insecticide, and its impact on the overall population has now been severely compromised. Under persistent selection pressure over several generations, resistant insects begin to outnumber susceptible ones, and the insecticide is no longer effective. The speed with which resistance develops depends on several factors, including how fast the insects reproduce, the migration and host range of the pest, the availability of nearby susceptible populations, the persistence and specificity of the crop protection product, and the rate, timing, and number of applications made to the crop. Resistance increases fastest in situations such as greenhouses, where insects or mites reproduce quickly. There is little or no immigration of susceptible individuals, and the user may spray frequently.